Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm happy to take a call on part two. This is no more than one, Mr. Quinn. The excitement's only just beginning. This is a substantial part of this bill, and we certainly received a number of submissions, and again I would like to address some of the concerns that submitters raised and give some of the reasons why the Select Committee may not have dealt with, or the way we dealt with the issues in the way that we did, and the reasons for that. The first was around clauses 28 to 31, which cover ownership and utility interest, and we had a large number of submissions on this. And the ownership interest is the interest that's assigned to the principal and to the accessory units in a unit title development by a registered valuer, and it's based on the unit's relative capital value. And that ownership interest can be used to determine a range of things, such as their share of common property or their voting share in any unit title development. So it's obviously very important, as well as any contribution they make to the Capital Improvement Fund. The second part of that, Mr. Chair, is the utility interest, which is also assigned to principal and accessory units. And this particular interest, the body corporate can vote to change the calculation around who pays what to a more fair and reasonable apportionment of the costs in that unit title development, and to assess their contribution for operational and for maintenance expenses. Under this piece of legislation, both of those interests may be assessed at any time, as long as 3 years has elapsed since the last reassessment. Now, I think it was fair to say that most submitters were generally supportive of what the bill was attempting to achieve here, and supported any moves to apportion operational and maintenance expenses more fairly amongst the owners of unit titles, as well as providing a time period to reassess. There were obviously some submitters who thought 3 years was too long, some submitters who thought 3 years was too short, but in the end what the Select Committee had to balance was not putting too much burden on a body corporate to continually be reassessing the apportionment of those costs, with the need for those to be updated regularly because those costs will change over time. There were some submitters who raised a question about whether it was fair that unit title owners whose units attracted a higher capital value should shoulder more of the expense, given that they benefit from having a higher capital value during the resale. That was something we considered. There were some submitters who felt that there wasn't enough regulation of how that reassessment would be calculated. They wanted to see far more stringent rules put around how that could be calculated and what kind of tests had to be met to make sure that that was done fairly. And there were some people who thought that after the deposit of the initial unit plan, that there should not be allowed to be any more reassessment, that once basically you've bought into the unit title development, you've been told this is what your costs are going to be, that those should not be allowed to be reassessed because that's essentially what you bought into. So those are all the kind of issues that the Select Committee had to take under advisement. Of course, we were given lots of examples of where people felt that this had been unfairly used. One of the main examples was who has to pay for the maintenance of a roof. Should it be the people who own the top units? Should it be everyone? Or should the people on top units have to pay more and the people on the rest pay a little bit less, or should everyone pay the same? Well, clearly everyone benefits from having an adequate roof on the top of a unit title development, but those are the kind of issues that body corporates are going to need to come to grips with, and we needed to provide a framework in which they could do that with the utmost flexibility according to the wide range of unit title developments that exist in New Zealand, because it is incredibly important that body corporates are able to apportion those expenses fairly, and it's fair to say that in the past some of them have felt that they haven't been able to do that under the existing legislation. And one of the examples that officials gave us were where you have a lift or an elevator in a building, should the people on the ground floor who don't benefit from having that in there have to pay for the maintenance of it, or should it be everyone in the unit title development that pays for that? I know it's riveting. It's riveting. You can always leave, Mr. Harawiri. You don't have to be here if I'm boring you. Again. I'm I'm not getting personal. He just says he finds this boring. This is actually an incredibly important piece of legislation, Mr. Quinn, an incredibly important piece of legislation that affects hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders. Mr. Chair. It took the Select Committee a long time to go through it technically. If Mr Harawira finds it boring, he can leave. He doesn't need to stay in the House. Or he's done it before, as my colleague says, like he did on the Auckland Governance Committee. But I believe that submitters who came along and raised genuine concerns deserve to hear why we didn't address some of the concerns that they raised and the reasons that we did it. So that's why I'm talking about it, Mr Harawira. Feel free to leave the chamber at any point or stand and make a contribution. So those were the issues that we had to weigh up, and I believe that the Select Committee did come to a fair and reasonable position. We don't want to encumber body corporates with too much regulation and be overly prescriptive because of the range of body corporate types out there. Which leads me to clauses 61 to 66, which deal with the establishment and constitution of body corporates. So at the moment, a body corporate is automatically created once a unit plan is deposited, and the body corporate, as I've said, is responsible for a range of maintenance functions with the common property and with the whole development. Now, we had a number of submitters who came along who are from very small developments who felt that it was unfair that they should be made to form a body corporate because of their size. Now, this was something we did consider at length, but the fact is, under this legislation, and you have to do it this way, otherwise you undermine the whole thing, a body corporate is automatically created once a unit plan is deposited, and if the developer selects to subdivide the land under unit title law, then that's just the way it is. And people buy into a unit title development knowing that, and we think on this side of the House that's fair enough. A body corporate at any time later can decide to cancel their unit plan and move and re-subdivide their land, re-subdivide their buildings and move into an alternate scheme. So that is an option that is available to them later on, but we certainly considered the issues and concerns raised by members who are from very small developments. But I have to say that one of the purposes for this legislation was actually to reduce the costs on body corporates overall, and so they will be reduced. So members of small developments who had concerns about the costs being overly burdensome on them because there were so few people to shoulder those costs can take heart that costs will be reduced because of this piece of legislation. And also, developments that comprise 9 or fewer units are not required to form a committee, and they may opt out of auditing requirements. So the legislation does allow certain compromises for small developments, but overall, if a developer deposits a unit plan and decides to create a subdivision under unit title, then a body corporate will be formed, and even small developments will need to go alongside that. The rights and responsibilities of unit holders was also clauses 67 to 71. Was also, and I alluded to it earlier, that submitters want us to be clearer about where the body corporate was responsible and where the individual unit holder was responsible. So what we did do was we amended clause 122 to add a subclause that made it clear under what circumstances the body corporate would be responsible for repairs and maintenance, and under what circumstances the unit holder would be responsible. So the unit owner must repair and maintain their own unit so that does not cause harm to other unit holders in a development. And in general, where the property is common, then it is the responsibility of the body corporate to recover the money expended for repairs, except in the situation where a unit holder has caused any damage to the property by their actions, in which case that unit owner will be held responsible. Now, this wasn't clear in the earlier legislation, and again we heard a number of cases, a number of horror stories actually, where the lack of clarity in the existing law had unfairly made people, or put the financial burden on people who clearly weren't responsible for those elements. But again, the clause 2, one of the most important parts about it is making it clear who is responsible for what expenditure that is carried out in a body corporate. I think we've managed to do it in a way that is flexible enough to encompass the range of body corporate sizes and structures that exist in New Zealand without putting too fair a regulatory burden on them, without putting in place strict regulatory systems that some may find too inflexible to deal with their own personal situation. And as I said, we have amended the legislation to make it far clearer, particularly when you have that interaction between the